Hello. Um, Per my promise, I'm recording Monday, September 27th lecture, which did not record properly in the classroom. So I'm going to record it right now. Today, we're going to talk about external anatomy and function. Maybe not. There it goes. But first, ancestral art. This is a 20,000-year-old representation of a flatfish from Andalusia, Spain. We know it's a flatfish because I move my face here so it's out of the way. Because the morphology is very representative of a species that we know that lives in the Mediterranean, including the shape of the opercular flap, that is the gill flap here, and the placement of the pectoral and pelvic fins, which you can see here and here, the shape of the caudal fin, which is very broad, and even the shape of the dorsal and anal fins very much reflects the shape of this fish. And in addition, this fish is laterally compressed and lying on its side. And so you can see the shape of the mouth reflects the sort of asymmetry that you would see of looking at this fish from the top, where its two eyes are on one side and the mouth is off to the essentially the mouth is on the anterior side. The mouth is symmetrical relative to the fish, but the fish is lying on its side. The eyes are asymmetrical in contrast. And then another image from the Lascaux cave in France, which is probably about 10,000 years ago. And these are Atlantic salmon. We know they're salmon because of some of the details in this painting. They have a little fin here, just beyond the dorsal fin. They've got their, they show the pelvic and the pectoral fins here, and then this little adipose fin, which is characteristic, and it's here as well. Well, it's missing on this one, but that's characteristic of salmonid. And so it just kind of, the cool thing is that it represents the sort of detail that that a hunter-gatherer society would have in terms of identifying and knowing the differences in their prey. So we're going to talk about structure and form today, what makes fish go and how they survive in the environment they live in. Because they're aquatic, it places key constraints on their design. But there are 40 plus fishes, I think, on Earth, and they exist in a wide variety of habitats, and those constraints are pushed to crazy limits that are really fun to observe. But today, we're going to try and look at, well, we'll look at some of the extremes and unusual forms. We're going to focus on the standard kind of body design of a fish and then examine some of the divergences that occur from that. For the most part, fishes can be organized into sort of functional categories by looking at body shape, scales, fins, mouth, as well as gill openings and sensory organs and other structures. And we'll try to whip through this in the next couple of days. External anatomy, first, the four directions. Head direction is anterior, posterior is tailward, dorsal is the back of the fish, and ventral is the bottom of the fish. You should know the terminology for all these structures. The mandible is the bottom jaw, like our bottom jaw. The maxillary is the upper jaw, but fish maxillaries are really different than tetrapod maxillaries. They have these complex hinged structures in them that make them very unusual by our standards. Nares is an equivalent of noses. There's sensory, chemosensory organs. Operculum is key to know. That's the gill cover that hides and protects the gills inside the head. Dorsal fin, sometimes there's just one dorsal fin. Sometimes there's two. So we have a first dorsal and a second dorsal fin. And some fishes, like the salmonids, have this adipose fin down here. The caudal fin, this structure is called the caudal peduncle, which ties the body to the tail. And this is the anal fin, the vent, which is used for excretion as well as for emitting gametes. And then the other paired fins, which are the pelvic and the pectoral fin. The bronchiostegal rays are what are used to suspend the gills, and also they assist with feeding. We'll get to that later. And then the lateral line. The lateral line are some modified cells that exist along the length of the fish. Generalized fish shape includes these common body plans, from compressed, which is laterally side to side compressed, globiform, which is a blob, anguilliform, which is eel-like, depressed, which is compressed. It's not compressed, but eoform is squished from top to bottom. So depressed, top to bottom, compressed, side to side. Fusiform, which is like an elongated tubular form, which tends to be favored by ambush predators that need short bursts of speed. And then tuniform, which is sort of missile shaped for fishes that travel long distances at high speeds. Body shape is related to movement. So fishes live in this viscous environment, and depending on how they navigate that environment, their shape determines how effectively and what strategy they use to navigate the environment. In the case of the fishes here on the left, that's an anguilliform shaped fish. And on the right, and sort of other extreme of movement, is a tuniform. And the gradient here is from undulatory to oscillatory. Undulatory means the whole body is involved. Oscillatory means mostly just the tail is involved. And you can see here some representative species of fishes for each one of these categories. The eels obviously are anguilliform in shape and in movement. The reef fish are laterally compressed, and they tend to be somewhat less oscillatory than the eels, but they're still somewhat oscillatory because they navigate a complex environment. And so that's an advantageous feature in a coral reef. And then northern pike here tend to be less undulating and more oscillatory, but they tend to be designed for short bursts because of their extreme length. And then the tuna, which is really the body tends to stay very stationary except for the tail that oscillates. And so we go through a quick quiz. What's the shape? Well, this is compressed. What's the shape? This is anguilliform. Shape here, you could argue if it was compressed or globiform, but I think we decided it was globiform. In this case, this is a northern gar, it's fusiform. And there's a gar being burned in effigy. I don't know why. I'll tell you why later. In the case of this giant fat fish, it's really globiform. It's not normally globiform, but it's globiform. And here's the same species, but a different body shape, obviously, because it's so much skinnier. It would be considered fusiform. And then here, so the next I want to talk about fish fins. Fins reflect the evolutionary history of the animal and how it gets a living. And they're involved in swimming, maneuverability, reproduction, predator avoidance and defense, and feeding. There's 5 main fin types. There's 2 sets of paired fins and then 3 unpaired fins. The pectoral and the pelvic fins are paired. I'll talk about their placement in a minute. And then there's the dorsal and anal, which are unpaired. The caudal fin or tail, unpaired. And then the adipose fin, which is actually not represented in any of these pictures, but occurs, take that back. Here we go. There's the adipose fin. So here's the dorsal, here's the pectoral, here's the pelvic, and here's the anal fin. And this is the caudal fin. And it's basically the same for each one of these species. Spines and rays. Fishes have rays that create durability and sort of rigidity to the fins. They provide structure that allow them to be more effective. In the case of rays, they tend to be soft and flexible. They're segmented and they're often branched. Spines are really bony and stiff and sharp, and they're not unsegmented. And it's the more derived fish, the acanthopterygian fishes, that have true spines. with the exception of the Ostariophysi, which includes the minnows, the cypriniforms, and the catfish, the cerulliforms. They have hardened rays, and they hurt just like spines, but they're actually not technically spines because of their sort of microstructures. So another look at the differences between rays and spines. This is of much interest to fish biologists because often the way to key out a species, which those of you in the lab will find out, is by counting the number of spines and rays. And here you can see these pointy, sharp-looking structures. These are all spines, and there's 10 of them on this particular fish. And the ones behind it, which you can kind of see are branching right here. See, that's a double branch there. And you can see up close here how the final ray is branched, I guess has 6, is that right? Am I counting right? 4 different branches off. So it branches once way down here, and then it branches again up here, creating 4 different branches at the tips, which is not typical, although it's typical of this particular fish, lepomid. And then you can kind of see the structure of the other rays up here. So there's 12 rays in this fish, and that's a key for identifying. And I included this because I wanted to see how the rays and the spines articulate with the skeleton, with the dorsal processes of the vertebrae, along with, so here in the anal fin, likewise, they articulate up here, and the pectoral and pelvic fin tend to articulate with the bony structures of the head. So pectoral fins, I don't know if my face is blocking the words, so I'm going to move it here. They're attached to the pelvic girdle, and they correspond with your arms or front legs of most tetrapods. They have multiple functions, and those are determined, or the functions can be determined from the shape. So long, pointed, and rigid, like you see in the tuna up here, provides stability and steering for those fast-moving kinds of fishes. In reef fishes, which I don't have an example of a reef fish here, but I did in previous slides, reef fish tend to be very compressed and disc-shaped. They can be pointed but more broad and a little more flexible, which provides them maneuverability and sculling, which they need because they're swimming around complex structure like in coral reefs or even rock reefs or kelp forests. Some fishes, like the Sacramento sucker here, is broad, more rounded pectoral fins that are spread out laterally, and that provides them stability and maneuverability in slow-moving waters and also on the bottom. And then there are some fishes that are extremely wide and broad, which provides even more bottom dwelling stability. So I guess what I was trying to point out here is sort of a gradient in terms of the pointiest and the broadest. And then there are sort of, just like there are different body shapes for different kinds of water and different kinds of life histories, there's also a variety of pectoral fins from like pointy to like really broad ones. And then the most extreme are like the rays that have extremely wide pectoral fins that are used for gliding or flying through the water, or for moving the sediment to uncover clams or worms, which is what they eat. The pelvic fins tend to be more posterior to the pectoral fins, and they can be placed at different points in the body, and we have terminology for that too to describe that placement. In more ancestral fishes, they're located way towards the back, like in this salmon, which is a Protocanthopterygian teleostean fish. So they're a little more ancestral. And this is called an abdominal placement. Fishes that have them moved up a little farther to the front, it's called thoracic placement. And when fishes have a pectoral fin that's even anterior, a pelvic fin that's even anterior to the pectoral fin, like right up here by the opercula, that's called jugular placement. And typically those fins support the pectoral fins and the other fins in terms of steering and stability, and also braking. So together, these paired fins provide steering capabilities. Like a bluegill, like in the picture here, can flare out its pectoral fins and its pelvic fins to a lesser degree. And it can essentially stop, or it can flare out a right fin and then scull with its left, and it'll turn right, likewise in the other direction. And then they can modify whether their dorsal fins are erect or down, which controls swimming speed, and also they can move them back up, which provides a braking opportunity as well. So they can use these fins in really complex ways to navigate their environment. Pectoral fins in sharks tend not to be very flexible. They're rigid and wing-like. They can be moved a little bit, but not complex, not collapsed. And essentially, they're stabilizers. Sharks don't have a swim bladder, which other more derived fishes have. Swim bladder is just a little balloon type organ inside the fish, and they can inflate it, which will make the fish sort of passively rise in the water column, or deflate it, which will make it go down in the water column. And sharks don't have that, so their pectoral fins are shaped, they're canted like that, ever so slightly. So the interior edge is leading up, and that, when they swim forward, that creates lift, which keeps the sharks aloft without a swim bladder. And it's necessary for sharks. They have to be aloft to be able to travel, and they have to be swimming almost constantly because they require ram breathing. The water's got to be constantly moving across their gills because they don't have the capacity to force water across their gills. Dorsal and anal fins, these are typically stability against roll and yaw, which are different motions. It's a three-dimensional environment, so there's lots of different ways to move. Roll is like this. My fingers are the head of the fish, and this is the dorsal fin on top. Rolling is just like this, rolling side to side. Yaw is a little different. Yaw is like this. That's that kind of oscillatory swimming movement, right? Like this. And there's a third direction, which we're not used to thinking about either, which is pitch. Pitch is like the angle. If this is the head, this is the tail, then it's the angle at which the fish is swimming. Dorsal and anal fins tend to be really long and thin on fast-moving predators, again, like tuna. Oftentimes, the dorsal and anal fins are even broken up into little tiny finlets behind them, or scutes. And these tend to reduce drag by breaking up the turbulence. Sharks also have dorsal fins, and they serve the same kind of purpose as dorsal and anal fins, as they do in other fishes. Eels and other anguilliform fishes have a really characteristic dorsal and anal fins. They're very, very long. They cover the length of the body, which allows them to dispel turbulent forces or drag that impede them from moving. Caudal fin is what we know as the tail, and symmetrical tails are called homocircle, and asymmetrical tails are called heterocercal. In the more ancestral fishes, those heterocercal tails have the spine that goes right up into the upper lobe. Homocircle tails, fishes with homocircle tails, the spine goes right to the end, and then the rays go out from top or bottom on these fishes. And really fast species, again, have like really reduced surface area. Their tail is essentially designed like a propeller to move them forward with a minimum amount of energy. More deep-bodied fish and globiform fishes have more square or slightly rounded tails. Like, you cannot see very well in this, but sorry, but this fish has this is a bluegill, and it has a kind of clunky wide tail, which helps it navigate complex environments. It's not a particularly fast swimmer. It's set up for darting, and so that tail gives a broad surface area, which allows it to flick and be gone. Most fishes have homocircle tails like that. In the cartilaginous and ancestral fishes, like the sarcopterygians and the neopterygians, they have these heterocercal tails, with the upper lobe usually being longer than the lower lobe. However, in the very evolved fishes, this is a flying fish, which is of the order Atheriniform. So the Atheriniforms are acanthopterygian fishes, and these tend to be the groups of fishes that are more surface-dwelling fishes that I mentioned last week. So this includes silver sides, it includes the live bearers like puppies and mosquito fish, and it includes the flying fish as well. So they have a reverse heterocircle tail. So the lower lobe is longer than the upper lobe, and the pectoral fins are reinforced with these very strong spines that make them wing-like. And so when they're being pursued, these fishes swim really fast through the water column up to the surface of the water. And you can see they have this very deeply forked, narrow tail. So they're fast-moving fishes, and they'll go right up out of the water. The wings will sort of bear them aloft above the water, and the tail, the lower lobe of the caudal fin, will stay in the water sculling and propel them along like that for long distances. And if they get enough speed, they'll actually go airborne, and people have seen them like flying over their boats or landing in the boats. It's actually kind of exciting. The adipose fin has sort of been like the long, it's kind of just been like the ugly stepchild of the fins, but it turns out that it's probably more important than we thought. It's fleshy and rayless, but it's got lots of nerve endings. And for a long time, we used it to clip and identify fishes. So we clipped their adipose fins if they were from a hatchery. But it's recently thought that it's not just a vestigial or ancestral structure that got carried along and gotten forgotten by evolution in the salmon and also in the catfish. It's recently proposed that it has a sensory function, and that it's got this concentration of nerves so that it can sense movement in the water and help the fish essentially have a feedback mechanism that helps the fish process water movement. And there's a relationship with the adipose fin, the caudal fin, and the decisions that the fishes make as they're moving through the water column. So it's interesting stuff. This is about a 10-year-old paper that identified that, and there's been some research since then. So this is the participation moment. So you've got till midnight on the 27th to submit this. So here's my question for you. You can talk to anyone or email anyone or look up anything you want to figure this out. Based upon the body shape and what we've talked about in the class, and the placement of the fins, the presence of rays and spines, and the color of the fish and the size of the eyes, what can you tell me about the life history of these two fishes with what you know? So things like, how do they eat? Maybe even what they eat, if you're creative. What habitats might they live in? Where in the water column do they live? What type of water flows can they handle? So if you would, go to Canvas for the module for the second week, and open up the participation credit for today, and enter a few lines describing what you think are the differences between these fish based upon the morphology. And this is a typical kind of question that I would ask on a quiz or an exam. This is just practice for you to think about. All right, I want to talk about fish scales now. There's 4 different kinds of fish scales, depending on, there's more ancestral scales and more derived scales. They're fortified by calcified material like bone or dentine. Most of the teleostean or modern fishes have an epidermis that covers them. And the more ancestral fishes like the elasmobranchs, the sharks, they protrude through the skin. They're just like little teeth that are sticking up out all over the body of the shark. And they've evolved independently. So we call them scales, but they've had different evolutionary pathways because they're so different. And the key thing is that in the more derived fishes, scale weight's greatly reduced. So in those neopterygian fishes, that wrestle with weight. One of the reasons that they have these scales is they create body armor, but the reason that they tend to be slow-moving fishes is that it weighs them down along with their spiny skeleton. So some, like the sturgeon, became cartilaginous, and others just deal with it. So let's talk about them. There's the placoid scales, or dermal denticles. That is like skin teeth, is what that means, that are found in most cartilaginous fishes, particularly the elasmobranchs. And they're tiny teeth, basically, or tooth-like structures. Modern teeth may have even, like modern teeth, meaning fish teeth, and maybe our teeth too, may have evolved from these scales. They don't grow in size with the fish like other scales. They just add more scales to make up for the space as they grow. And shark skin has this crazy sandpapery feel if you've never felt the shark. It's really cool. It's like feeling coarse sandpaper. And it's because these little teeth are sticking up all over your body. Ganoid scales are the types of scales that are found in like the Neopterygian, more ancestral fish, sturgeon, paddlefish, gars, bowfin, shears. They're diamond-shaped teeth, diamond-shaped or rectangular scales. And you can see an old illustration here. They're not overlapping. They tend to interlock, but they're like puzzle pieces that fit over the shape of the fish. And they're covered with this enamel-like substance called ganoin, which is what gives them their names, ganoid scales. And these scales can be like, they're really tough. They're really armor plating. And so like when you look at something like a pike, this is a gar here. Some of these scales can be really big. You can kind of tell these little rectangular structures or diamond-shaped structures are like the size of a thumbnail. And they're, they're very effective for armoring this very ancient species of fish. The cycloid scales are much more derived. So we find these in the teleostean fishes, and they tend to be lightweight. They're somewhat flexible. Cycloid scales tend to have a smooth texture and a smooth outer edge. They're sort of uniform in shape. And it's thought that these are related to ganoid scales, that these might form the inner layer of ganoid scales. The cool thing is that they lay down rings every year, as do ctenoid scales. Ctenoid scales are very much like cycloid scales, but they're much more irregular in shape. That is, they have these shapes that they've evolved that are sort of characteristic of their species often. And the scales tend to be evolved with these structures in response to some kind of a need. Again, they lay down annuli. So one way to age a fish is to count the rings on the scales. And assuming that the scale at that spot wasn't lost and then replaced by a young scale, you can get an estimate of fish age without having to kill the fish. And sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. Other structures are more reliable, but generally rely on killing the fish. Bony plates and scutes are different structures that are related to scutes, but then that are related to scales but aren't. These are bony plates. They contain bony cells, and in fishes like sturgeon and armored catfishes, and even some of the more derived fishes like sticklebacks and seahorses, they're bony plates that are ossified, and so they probably evolved independently. Tuna also have scutes, which help them dispel some of the energetic resistance to swimming through the water. Anyway, so bony plates and scutes. I want to talk also about mouth types. You can tell a lot about a fish by the shape of its mouth. Bottom feeding fishes have inferior mouths. Top feeding fishes have superior mouths. They're pointing up. And most fish mouths are at the end of the snout for feeding. That's a terminal mouth. So this fish is superior. It's pointing up. It's a little hard to tell, but this fish got a little sad frown because some person's holding it. It's really extreme. It's really pointing up. That's a gambusia or mosquito fish, which are used for vector control. It's probably the most invasive fish in the world because they're cast everywhere by vector control to control mosquitoes and malaria. On this fish, there's a mouth down here on the bottom. What would you call that? Inferior. And this one right there at the end, that's a terminal mouth, or maybe a subterminal mouth, depending on who you ask. So finally, measuring fish size is like getting metrics on fishes is really important to fisheries managers. And I just want to show that there's different ways of measuring fish. The way that I usually use is standard length, which is to the end of the backbone. But other people use fork length, which is where the caudal fin forks, or even total length. The problem with that is that sometimes the rays on the caudal fin can become frayed, and so you might underestimate the length of the fish. And so a lot of scientific researchers use standard length. It's a little harder to determine. But anyway, the combination of length and weight gives you a length-weight relationship. And this is always a really good indicator of condition of a fish. So if you have a fat fish, or excuse me, a skinny fish, or a slightly fatter fish, or a super skinny fish, they're going to come out at a different spot on this curve. This curve is length to weight. And so you would expect that fishes that are older are going to weigh more. So this curve is going in an upward direction. But most fishes, the research or the growth is allometric. So they're growing in 3 directions, right? And so you would expect that it wouldn't be a linear relationship. It would be an exponential relationship because you're increasing their size in 3 dimensions. So it's an exponent of 3 relative to length. And so we see that this is a curved relationship. Fish tend to grow fatter. They tend to weigh more. They gain weight more quickly than they grow. And so you see this exponential relationship. And you can determine condition because the rate of this curve is determined by things like food availability and the habitat that fish live in, and stress that fish are under. And so if fish are falling under this curve, then you would say they probably have a lower condition factor than fishes that are falling above the curve. And so it's a useful way for evaluating the condition of a fish population. And here's a big old fat fish. And you would guess this is a very high condition factor, as opposed to this one, which is kind of a medium condition factor. They're all the same species. And then this, which is rather skinny, and would say it has a low condition factor. So it's not as healthy a fish. Next stuff up, finish the participation credit for this lecture. It's just a few sentences if you haven't already. Read chapter 5 and 6 from Helfman to get up on internal body structures and anatomy. And then there's a cool story here from Newsweek about how shark teeth evolve from taste buds, which is another freaky thing about fish. So check it out. I'll see you on Wednesday. Thank you.